I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the GoldMoney Foundation. I'm here with a longtime friend, Reg Howe. Reg played a key role in the early days of GATA by taking on, as Chris Powell describes it, all of the money and power in the world with a case that was brought in federal court in Boston. You know, the results of the case and everything surrounding the case are well known, but you know, ever since then, which I guess was what, 2001 is when the case was brought forward, or a little bit later than that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it ran 2001, 2002. I'd have to go back and look at the dates, but roughly that time frame.
There are some interesting elements to it, and it also leads to the bigger picture of, you know, constitutional money. You know, what is constitutional money in the United States? And I'd sort of like to explore that topic with you, because you did give a brilliant presentation at the GATA conference here in London on this particular topic. And you know, what's quite clear to me is that what we have today is not really constitutional money.
No, it's pretty clear under the Constitution that money should be linked to gold or silver. That's the way it was before the Civil War, and nobody prior to the Civil War would have ever suggested that the legal tender or the constitutional standard value could be anything other than gold or silver. And then we went through several stages. During the Civil War, because of the financial problems, the government issued greenbacks, which were a paper legal tender. You might expect the constitutionality of the greenbacks was challenged. Cases went against them first, and then a rehearing or new case was brought, and finally the Supreme Court in the legal tender cases said that the greenbacks were constitutional, but they went out of their way to say that the government could not make paper money a standard of value, and they treated the greenbacks as if they were a promise to pay gold dollars, but at some later time. A few years later, and there was also worries at that time, the question of whether maybe it was, if it was okay, maybe it was just okay as a war measure. A few years later, sometime around 1876-7, about the same time that the United States was going back on the gold standard after the Civil War, the Resumption Act had been passed. Another case came before the Supreme Court on the greenbacks, and the court basically said the government had the power to make paper a legal tender, war or no war. But as I say, it was kind of academic. There was a lot of controversy about that case. Most people regarded it as a wrong decision in terms of constitutional law, but because the country was going back on the gold standard anyway, it, as I say, became kind of academic. It didn't really resurface until the New Deal and the confiscation of gold and the devaluation of the dollar, and then it provided some precedent for the so-called gold clause cases, where the government wanted to avoid paying its bondholders. Well, what had happened is, as a result of the greenback, most bonds had a clause in them that they were repayable in dollars at the existing parity, so that if there were a devaluation, you were still going to get the equivalent amount of gold.
This is the so-called gold clause.
Right. So these were the gold clauses that were basically, by that time, in pretty much all major financial transactions, bonds, stuff like that.
Reflecting the fact that gold is really the standard of value, not some piece of paper called a dollar or a pound or something else.
Right. Right. That the dollar or whatever that piece of paper was accepted at a certain parity, a certain exchange rate with gold. And when you got repaid, you were supposed to, in effect, get the same amount of gold back. So the case that finally got to the Supreme Court, technically the Supreme Court never really ruled on the confiscation issue. That had been ruled on in lower courts, but it wasn't really challenged in the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, as you might expect, the bondholders were trying to get paid at the old parity. That is, they
$20.67 per ounce.
They wanted that amount of gold, or the equivalent, so they wanted, you know, for instead of at the $35 an ounce. And the Supreme Court somewhat divided opinion, but ultimately by one vote decided that the government was able really to evade paying at the old parity because, as they put it, the dollar still had the same silver value and it still had the same buying power as before.
Mm-hmm.
So despite having a lot of nice sounding words about the government's obligation to make good on its debts, they basically did get away with paying at the new parity. But the key thing about all those cases is that the dollar was still always defined with reference to gold or silver.
Right.
Even though we couldn't own gold, the dollar was still $35 an ounce.
It was the standard of value for measurement.
So it was the standard of value. And that really didn't change until Nixon closed the gold window in 1971.
Yeah, and we now have fiat currency.
Completely fiat system since.
Backed by nothing except government promises, essentially.
And that basically frees the government from any discipline over the issuance of money or creation of debt or sale of bonds, et cetera, et cetera. So